Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and an impromptu Ask Me Anything to replace a show that hasn't happened for whatever reason, which I will find out later. So, as you know, I haven't been streaming for the last 9 or 10 days, wherever it's been, because I was on a trip to Poland and Germany. And I was planning to tell you all about it, but not quite today. I wasn't expecting to do it right now. So at one point, I thought I would do a debrief of the whole trip. Then I thought maybe I'll just talk about Stalag Luft III and Colditz. And in the end, I'm just going to talk about Stalag Luft III. I also went to Auschwitz. I went to Krakow. I went to Wrocław. And I also went in Krakow to the Krakow Plaszow concentration camp, which is the one featured in Schindler's List. But I will talk all about that at some point in the future. So I'm a bit unprepared for this, but there you go. That is how it is. Spontaneous is good. So there we are. I will find out what happened to my guest earlier, and I will try and get that rescheduled at some point. So if you know me, if you know my channel, you'll know a lot of my inspiration for the reason I talk about World War II. The reason I have interest in there is going back to my childhood. The last Ask Me Anything I did, I talked about my background, my early years, my formative years, and war movies, comics, etc., etc., etc. And I have to say, my favorite war film, and possibly my favorite film of all time, despite its inaccuracies, is The Great Escape, 1963, Steve McQueen, James Garner, Richard Attenborough, David McCallum, etc., etc., etc. And it's been on my list to visit the site of that near Zagan in Poland, and I can't believe it's taken me 55 years to get there. And I would like to extend my thanks to David and Stephanie, who organized the trip. And we were there last Wednesday. I was in Auschwitz. I was in Stalag Luft III on Saturday. I was there, so it's only a Wednesday, and here I am back here talking about it. So I have to say, I'm still processing everything I saw during that week, because it really was a contrast. The evenings in Krakow, which is now a beautiful city, we did a little touristy carriage ride around the main square there, looked at the buildings there. There's a castle we went past. There's the church come cathedral there that we looked inside, had some great food there, had a couple of beers in a bar. The same thing happened later in the week, and then in between the dining out and the hotels, of course, we were delving into World War II, and with some of the places, Auschwitz notably, the darker, horrific aspects of World War II. But Stalag Luft III, not quite in the same league, obviously, as somewhere like Auschwitz. It wasn't a death camp, it was a prisoner of war camp. And although 50 prisoners were murdered, of the 76 who escaped from the camp, and several thousand died over the course of the war in the various camps around Zagan, because the museum is situated in what was Stalag 8C, and then you walk into the woods and there is Stalag Luft III. And there were other camps in the area, and there were French prisoners, there were Russian prisoners at various times, British, American, Commonwealth, etc., etc. And so that was quite a moment. So there we are. I'm going to talk about my trip there. I've managed to just throw together some photos, and we decided to do it as a group in an order that maybe it wouldn't be everybody's logical order. We were staying in Zagan itself, in the rather curious Villa Park Hotel, which I left a weird review for on TripAdvisor Day. It's a very unusual place. And we thought we'd go to the station first, the rail station, because, of course, the station featured heavily in the plans of the escapers. If you are familiar with the details of the escape from the camp in March 1944, Buschel's plan was for 200 prisoners. Some sources say 250. They were numbered, but I think there's some discrepancy about they're hoping to get 200 out, but there was 50 on a reserve list. We'll talk about that later. And again, I haven't really prepared for this other than what I did last week. And the first, few dozen were attempting to take trains, and then the latter escapers were going to be hard-arsing, and that was the word, the escapers too, hard-arsing it across Poland and trying to get back to Allied lines. And one of the reasons the camps were situated where they were, and I will talk about Colditz because I went there the following day in another one of these programs, is they were in the heart of the Nazi Empire, as far as away as possible from safety. So Switzerland is hundreds of miles away. The coast is hundreds of miles away, and the rail links were convenient for the Germans to get prisoners there, but they also meant the prisoners could use the rail system. And as soon as I mentioned railways, Dr. Philip Blood appears in the sidebar there, like David O'Keefe. When I say his name, Ultra, or say Ultra, David O'Keefe appears. When I say railways, Philip Blood appears. So Zagan station was incredibly important to the escapers. And so we walked through there first. There's also a little railway museum in the terminal building. It's an odd station because it's been modernized, but it doesn't seem to have that many people going through it. The car park outside had about 20 cars in it, but back at the time it was on the main line from Berlin to wherever it goes in the other direction, which I cannot remember off the top of my head. So this is an old original sign for when it was Zagan as part of Germany. Now it is Zagan as part of Poland. And one of the things about this trip is that as you go around the German-Polish border, you hear about all the changing histories of the region, the border changes over the many centuries that occurred. And so we stayed in Wrocław, which was Breslau, the German name in World War II. This was interesting. As far as I know, this underpass under I think it's 6 lines there, was the one that takes you to the south side of the station. And if you read about the Great Escape, and there are various good books on it, there's one by Jonathan Vance, one by Ted Barris, Guy Walters wrote about it, of course. There's the other one, Paul Brickhill's original book, The Great Escape. There's numerous books on it. In the dark, as the prisoners make their way out of the camp towards the station, they had trouble finding the south entrance. And this is the south side of the tracks. And that the little building they were looking for is that building on the left there, not the kind of large grey building, which I assume is period. The little grey bit, the little kind of tiled roof entrance to the underpass on the left there. And what happened with the escape is that some of the prisoners just didn't find that in the dark and ended up, rather than catching a nighttime train, and of course during World War II there were trains running at night because the Allies could control the skies during the day. So the nighttime was part of the Germans' best chance of moving both men and material and transport and what have you through their Reich, and had to wait for the daytime trains. Now, of course, by the time the daytime trains are running, the alert had got out. The Germans had discovered the escape, and of course there were Gestapo and police and all sorts of military units on every railway platform from Zagan right the way across essentially the whole Reich. And as you know, many of the escapers were captured within hours. Just a few days. And as I said earlier, 50 of the 76 men who got out were murdered upon recapture. And I think it was 17 were returned to the Stalag Luft III. Others were returned elsewhere. And only 3 made a successful home run, if I remember correctly. 1 Norwegian, 2 Dutchmen. It might have been 2 Norwegians and 1 Dutchman, Bob van der Stok being one of them. But that little building on the left was the one that the prisoners failed to find, or some of them failed to find. And that's an air raid shelter. There is an air raid shelter just coming out from the southern, the subway underneath the railway lines, and there are other buildings around the southern side which are in a pretty poor state now. This is me and my friend David walking the reverse route. So we are going from the station towards the camp and towards the exit point of Harry, the tunnel they broke out of, and then we walked. Having visited Harry and the other parts of the Luft III camp in the forest, we then went back to the station, got in our car and drove the way round through Zagan and ended up at the museum, which is on the site of 8C. So that's me walking with my friend in the background there. So this is Harry and Harry exit point, which, if you remember, if you know from the film, they had miscalculated the distance, and instead of coming out the exit of the tunnel clear into the trees, it came out kind of on the line of trees. a couple of counts say it was just within the trees, but it was still quite exposed by the searchlight from the camera. Others say it hadn't quite made the tree line. Basically, it doesn't really matter. The point is, it was meant to come out sort of deeper into the forest to completely cover up with kind of darkness the escape, but it came too close to the perimeter wire of the prisoner of war camp. And there are music panels around about the forest that tell you about the escape, tell you about the history of the tunnels and the tunneling, and I'll talk about the museum later on. So there again is the Harry exit point. There is also a suggestion, because they did some ground penetrating radar a few years ago, that the tunnel might just be 4 or 5 feet to the right of where they've marked it out today. If you remember, there have been various documentaries where they took POWs who were there and they went back and did archaeology and excavations, and though the museum has been there for several decades, the refinement of their knowledge has carried on, and is still carrying on to get more and more information about it. And of course, it's also like the forests in the Ardennes. It is a working, living forest. So there are still felling of trees in the area, because that's what forests do. But this isn't meant to necessarily be me just telling you what I saw. It's going to be me about talking about my reaction to this. So remember, I said a few minutes ago that film was incredibly important to me. I read the Paul Brickhill book. I read everything about escape. So I was interested in Colditz. I read Pat Reed's books, and I'll talk about, I say, Colditz in another point. I don't know what systems they used, Andreas. I know they. Oh, that's my big style response. I'm going to change it to the normal style there. Let me get back into that. Was it? That's the style it should be. I don't know what systems they use. They use various technological systems there. I say I wasn't expecting to do this show right now, so I haven't done enough preparation. I think it was GPR, but I maybe I'm so. But anyway, my reaction to standing there was well, I was glad. Well, I was there with one of my best friends, David. Of course, I was there with Mag, and I was David's wife, Stephanie. We were there together, and Mag was enjoying the fact I was appreciating being there, and David was appreciating being there with me, his friend, and I was appreciating being there with him. And weirdly, now I'm back. It's odd having struck off 2 places from my must-see list, because Colditz and Stalag Luft III have been on my must-see of places for 5 decades, and now they're off the list. I'm both pleased I went there, but also sad in some ways that they've gone off my list, because I've got to now promote some other sites to number 1, and I'm not sure what site's going to go up there. But this is the marked out Harry tunnel going back to the site of Hut 104, which is the one it came from. And if you remember, Harry was the longest of the 3 tunnels. There was Tom, Dick, and Harry, and the reason they were confident that Harry would not be detected is that it wasn't against the wire. They're between Hut 104 and the ones next to it was the German area. So the cooler and parts of the German buildings were between the hut that the tunnel began from and the perimeter wire. So the assumption was the Germans would never believe a tunnel would come from that side. They would come from the side that Tom and Dick came from, which is round 1 to the west. And indeed, they found Tom. So this one was never detected until the actual night of the escape, when, as you know from the film and from the books, that as they were coming out, a German pretty much stepped right up to the prisoners getting out of the hole, and all the hell kicked off. And yeah, it is representative historic sport. You can actually, back at the museum, go into a not 9 meters down section of tunnel. It's about, I guess, 8 foot down, and you can actually go through the tunnel. But the little pulley system, because you lie on a little trolley, like in the real escape and like in the movie, and then you use ropes to pull you up. But it's not connected anymore. They haven't kind of restored it, and I didn't fancy literally crawling through it. It's the tunnel, the replica tunnel is, I don't know, 10 meters long or something. So I didn't go down that. So yeah, that's the width of the rails, but the tunnel isn't much wider. I mean, you couldn't actually if you weren't on the little trolley, I don't think you could go through on your hands and knees. You'd have to kind of almost leopard crawl through it. It really is a very, very narrow space. I'll keep on going with my photos, and there's the entrance to the tunnel there. And there's, as you can see there, people leave poppy crosses and candles and things like that. So, you know, it is what it is. And these are the names of the men who got out, so in different colors depending on whether they survived. So in green are the ones who made the home run. So I'm right, it was 2 Norwegians and one Dutchman. So Van der Stok is a Dutchman who went back home, who got back home. And as you go along the length, you see the various names there. So the ones in black were the ones murdered. So Kidder, one of the guys murdered by the Gestapo. Wiley was murdered by the Gestapo. Blue are the ones who didn't get killed. They were either recaptured and either taken back to the camp or taken elsewhere. Al Haik, second name there, was the compass maker, for example. And this is the Great Escapers, 24th night of the 24th, 25th of March, 1944. And so we must always remember that it was a truly international affair. The camp had Poles and Danes and Norwegians and South Africans and Canadians. The Americans had been in the same compound, and some Americans had worked on the tunnel, but they were moved to another compound prior to the escape. So no Americans apart from Major John Dodge, who was British by birth, but British by citizenship, or the other way around. He's the guy played by Christopher Reeve in the sequel, Great Escape 2. He was in his 40s or late 30s, and he was part of the escape, but he was technically a British citizen. He was certainly serving in the British Army. So he's the only American actually involved in the real escape, unlike in the movie there's Steve McQueen and James Garner. So standing there was a really profound feeling. I'm just whizzing through these photos because I've got a lot here to talk about. And the other thing that I couldn't help thinking about when I was there was whether or not it was worth it, because Bushell's idea was to not necessarily get all these guys back home. That's what they individually were thinking. I'm sure if you were an Australian or British pilot in that camp, when you broke out, your hope was to get back home. Bushell's hope was really to snarl up the German war machine, cause problems on the fronts that the Germans were fighting on still in 44, and it probably was the work of Guy Walters to really suggest that it didn't do that. The fact is, they rounded up these prisoners so damn quickly, it didn't really affect the German war machine. It didn't really cause any damage to the German war effort at that point. That they were swept up very quickly by the Hitler Youth and the police and the Gestapo, and I'm not in any way condoning the fact these guys were murdered, because of course that was a tragic event. But Bushell's aim to damage the war effort didn't happen, and what did happen is 50 men got murdered. And of course we mustn't forget the effect it had on other camps and the general experience of POWs. We've done some shows on the channel about American 8th Air Force people and other air crews who were shot down after March 1944, because your chances of being looked after well actually got worse as the war went on in some ways. If you were captured in 1940-41, as we know from what happened to the early prisons at places like Colditz and the other offlags and stalags, is that they were treated very well, and escapers were just returned to the camp they came from. But as escapes became more and more frequent, and Colditz was the most successful camp in terms of home runs, the Germans just got more and more revengeful in what they did to returning prisoners. And as we happened with this case, 50 ended up being murdered. And later on, well, as Philip Blood is saying there, I might as well quote a proper real historian. Afterwards, the Germans declared the escapes a war crime and an act of bandang. I can't say that word because I'm tired. Bandan Bekamp from 24th of March 1944. I'm sorry, folks. I am really tired. I still haven't got enough sleep since returning from the trip. But this is the thing: the impact was exactly what Bushell didn't want. It didn't affect the German war machine. It actually made them more determined to punish. And like the the experiences of prisoners in the camps kind of got worse. I think Masters of the Air reflected that a little bit. The episodes when you see Buck and Bucky inside the camp, it wasn't the camp we've known from from the movies like The Great Escape, where the sun is always shining and they seem to be well fed. It was cold. That coming out of the way. And then of course there was the Death March. Or death marches, I should say. So many camps, the Germans ended up moving prisoners and men died. So the Great Escape, in my head, I have a complicated reaction to it, because on the one hand, I love the movie. I love the idea of these brave individuals trying to get back home, and the incredible technology they developed. The kit bag pumps there, the fact they were able to have these tunnels lit by electric lights, and the fact they disguise the entrances and all that and the replica, the forged passes and all the information, that is something to be admired, as we can admire the incredible daring do of the guys getting out of Colditz and other prisoner of war camps, because of course there were breaks out of camps in other countries, not just these famous ones of Stalag Luft III in Poland as it is now, and Colditz in Germany as it is now. So that in what way, Andreas? Sorry, whether I'm occupied or not. I mean, this is the other thing: is that home run. If you're a Dutchman, a home run is not the same as if you're a Brit, because you're going back to the Netherlands, which is still occupied by the Germans. The Norwegians, if you get back to Norway, it's still occupied by the Germans. So it does muddy the waters and make things complicated. So Andreas, that's a very interesting point there. Guy Walters, when he wrote The Real Great Escape, tried to find anything that was written down that suggests that, well, evidence of the fact it is a British officer's duty to try and escape. He couldn't find anything. So what he found out is that a British officer, and by British officer I mean anybody serving within the Commonwealth, so Canadians, Australians, New Zealanders, South Africans, etc., etc. As an officer, you were supposed to resist capture. Now that is written down so that if you're holding a line, you're not meant to just, when things look a bit bad, say, well, come on then, chaps, let's make a white flag and walk towards the enemy. You're not supposed to do that. You're supposed to keep on fighting until there's no other options, and then and only then can you surrender. But Guy couldn't find anything about, after being captured, once you are with the status of prisoner of war, that there is any duty to try and escape. Not official in terms of what is written down within the British Army or the British services. Now, of course, there is perhaps a moral obligation to try and break out, and that's a different thing. But one of the other things I got myself thinking about is the reminder, and the guide at Colditz particularly reminds us of this, that even at Colditz, as with Stalag Luft III, which were camps for the bad boys, they were for the frequent escapers, is that even in those camps, the majority of men imprisoned there were not involved in escaping. They were just trying to sit out the war. And Stalag Luft III had thousands, and yes, hundreds were involved in the escape. They were the stooges watching what the Germans were doing. They're the guys making the compasses, forging the papers. We've all seen the movies. But a lot of men weren't involved in that. And the tragedy of the 50 being murdered is, of course, there. But the great majority of Allied aviators who were imprisoned in Stalag Luft III returned from the war alive. And actually, the rations, the food in these camps wasn't totally terrible. I mean, certainly, as I said, I went to this on the Saturday, having been to Auschwitz on the Wednesday, and the concentration camp outside of Krakow on the Thursday. And you simply cannot compare the two. I mean, except the fact that they are behind wire and held by the Germans, there's no comparison at all. The Stalag Luft III had recreation areas, they had theaters, they had libraries, they were able to educate themselves. Most of the Allied camps, by the end of the war, with the Red Cross doing sterling work getting food to these guys, the prisoners were actually better fed than the Germans guarding them. And when I say Germans, I don't always mean Germans. I mean people from the greater German Reich. And the quality of the guards was pretty poor, old men and young boys and that kind of. So, these guys in the prisoner of war camps, sure, it felt pretty bad, and I'm not dismissing the difficulties of being a prisoner for several years and what that has, the effect that has on your mental health and all that. But compared to what was going on in the actual concentration camps, there's no difference. So it was interesting for me to seeing those two types of places within the same week, because it got my brain working. And yeah, there was lots to think about. Yes, James, in Colditz, there was a British officer that feigned insanity, ended up going. Well, I guess we don't use. Do we use the word insane anymore? But he never recovered his mental faculties. So this is the slab, I believe, that is beside the Harry Tunnel entrance. That was the slab the Germans put over the tunnel once they discovered it. They filled it all up with sand and sewage, apparently, and then, obviously it was never able to be used again. There was a fourth tunnel, George, that was started later that, of course, never happened, because even the prisoners themselves realized that if you're going to just get murdered by the Gestapo, if you get captured, as Phil Blood and others have said in the sidebar, it's no longer a game. And I have this conversation with Colin, who's watching. Hi, Colin. All the time about this idea that Colditz is in some ways kind of this posh kids trying to get one over matron. It's public school boys, and so lots to think about. This is the fire pool in the middle of Stalag Luft III, the north compound where the escape came from. There's lots and bits and pieces of the pilings of the huts as you walk through the forest there, but apart from the Harry entrance, nothing is marked. Well, I say that in the other compound there is the marker to the wooden horse escape, but we didn't quite get time to go there because we had to drive on to Rochlitz, and with a long drive, and we'd spent rather too long trying to find Tom and Dick. So these are parts of the underground bits, because you have the washrooms, and you've seen the film, you know what they're. And it was just me, David, Magali, and Stephanie wandering around this. There was no one else there. We went to the museum. There was another dozen or so people there. But for this moment, it was just us there. And although we were only about 500 yards or so from, maybe a bit more than that, from the railway line, we didn't hear any trains. There were no animals around. It was pretty much completely silent when we were walking around. And there's a replica guard tower right near where Harry was. So these are just bits and pieces of the camp that you can still find there. And then we walked our way, as I said, back to the station to then drive round and get to the museum itself. So that's the station, and obviously there's modern platform coverings and things there, but the lines and the platforms, I think, are pretty original. This is the underpass there, and that lettering there we reckoned might be old enough to be from the war, because once you come out through the subway, you go through another dark building, then you come up through this sort of entrance on the southern side, and the room you come up through to the steps was an air raid shelter in World War II. I wonder whether that marking there is old enough to be World War II. There's also, on the north side of the tracks, there's a steam engine that is preserved. I have no idea. Phil might know if that's old enough to be from World War II. There was a photo pictured of it running in 1979. I've no idea. I'm not even going to attempt to guess how old that train is there, but it basically looks a bit like a wartime train, I suppose. And there's another few of the southern or the northern side of the railway line. So then we drove around the museum, and I liked the fact that the museum doesn't try and so Phil says it's from about 1910, so it is old enough. Thank you very much. I bow to your knowledge, Dr. Arkan there. So yeah, we know. So James is saying when he was there with Guy, he went back. He went back to the station. So we did it both ways. We went from the station to the camp, and then from the camp to the station, and then drove around the museum. We could have walked all the way to the museum. Then we'd have to walk all the way back to our car. But I was going to say they don't disassociate themselves from the movie. The museum acknowledges that the movie is a big source of inspiration to people visiting there, and they don't dismiss it as being Hollywood hokum. Of course, there are bits that entirely are fictionalized. The escape in the aircraft by James Garner and Donald Pleasance, and James Coburn's cycle ride, all that kind of stuff is fictionalized. But it's all grounded in the real truth. I mean, there is no motorbike escape, but they could have just in a kind of a snooty academic way, kind of disassociate themselves for the movie, but they don't. They kind of embrace it and say, look, I expect a lot of the people who go there, that is their primary frame of reference. Of course, Guy Walters takes groups there where they've read his book, and people like me and David have read books about the Stalag Luft III, but a lot of people probably just really have seen the movies. They don't try and, pretend it didn't happen. And the museum is pretty good. It's the lady there who lets you in and takes the money is very nice. It's cash only. You can't buy any of the books for sale with credit cards, and we'll be using our zloty to buy stuff. I bought myself and David the little capsules of sand from Harry from the excavation a few years ago, from the 80th anniversary of the escape. You can buy little capsules of sand, which are quite cool. And I bought a fridge magnet and a couple of things, not just because I want them, but also because I believe in supporting these little museums, essentially in the middle of nowhere. Because, folks, if you're thinking of going to that part of Poland, there's basically fuck all to see around Zagan. When we drove from there, I guess it was about 2.5 hours to Rochlitz, and Rochlitz is where we stayed for for Kolditz. Okay, it was a dark, grey, cloudy kind of November day, but on the drive there was nothing we really saw. We really understood why they filmed it near. They used the Munich film studios for Great Escape, and they filmed the escapes in that kind of area. So much more a nicer part of Germany, stroke Poland, with kind of rolling alpine meadows and wooden buildings and all that kind of. The architecture around Zagan, apart from a couple of buildings, is a little bit kind of industrial. The countryside around it was not, in my opinion, terribly appealing. So there's the photo of the whole compounds as they were by the time you get this entire large complex. So the red arrows there are showing where Stalag Luft III was. So there's and then the longer red arrow going up down is where Harry was, and you can see Tom and Dick just below that to the left, and up in the top right corner are the 6 lines of the Zagan station. So you can see how close it is. So we walked from the top right corner through the forest to the Harry point there. Then you've got the other compounds over there. So Stalag Luft 8C is its sort of top left corner. So, and then there's a greater photo showing where it fits into the kind of the transportation system around it, because prisoners were taken there on railway lines and then walked, as we walked through those forest paths to the camp. Very few would have been taken by truck. And there's lots of things, of course, from the from both artifacts recovered by people who were there and kept, and others they have dug up from the site. So, dominoes and knives, forks and spoons and things like that as examples of the compasses they made, etc. And of course the famous diagram of the tunnel, and it surprises people that it was 9 meters down, but they had to go that far down to be beyond the detection. The Germans had microphones buried in the earth, and that was a difficulty with dispersing the earth from the tunnel, because the earth from the tunnel was sand down that far top, but the compound was kind of brown dirt, so that when they tried to just put it on the surface, it obviously stood out like a sore thumb. So you had the penguins, so they had the bags in their trousers to kind of disperse the earth during football matches and knockabouts, and when they're doing parade grounds. And of course they hid other bits in the roofs of the huts, and you've seen the film. And they, of course, don't just talk about the escapes from Stalag Luft III. They talk about the other compounds where French prisoners were, other British prisoners. There were Soviet prisoners there. These are other things. In this case, this is stuff they have found from the archaeology. So heel irons and the hobnails from boots and bits of leather soles of boots, things like that. There's a Bakelite record. I think that may be upside down. A Bakelite record there that they used to make the compasses from them, or the compass kind of holders out of Bakelite from 78 records. And outside the museum is a replica of Hut 104, and which was a kind of a town initiative. Some local youth volunteers were involved in it, and we did notice inside. This is me being really purist. It was made with kind of modern tongue and groove inside the paneling and plywood. It wouldn't have been tongue and groove back then, but hey, I'm picky, being picky. It's great to get a sense of. It was bigger than I thought it was going to be. The movies didn't suggest they was wide. I was thinking of something narrower. But you know, and so inside the hut, you have display rooms about the way each room was set up, and you have the ablutions, and the hut kind of commander would have maybe a room to himself and things like that. And they've set it up all very well with Red Cross boxes, and there's pictures on the walls, and there's the bunk beds, and what have you. It does definitely give you a feel of it. And as I said earlier, standing in that, having stood in Auschwitz-Birkenau 4 days earlier, and considered how, you know, you have 5, 6 women crammed onto a kind of a brick shelf with no sanitation. There's no comparison. I'm glad I did it this way round. I'm glad I've had all this sensory overload in 1 week, and I will talk at some point in the future about my reaction to the death camps and things like that. But I thought for this impromptu one, I would talk about just Stalag Luft III and my reaction to that. And yeah, there's books on the shelves and the lamps there, and you know, and they talk about some of the people who were there and what happened to them after the war. And there's one of a replica of the pumps. So these are the things James Coburn as Sedgwick makes in the movie, but in reality, the escapers made, who because it was mostly amalgamations in the movie. Bushell is called Bartlett, and Hiltz and all those cats. They didn't actually exist. David McCallum is based on his Ashley Pitt is based on a naval officer, and they all have their origins in real people. But the other thing the museum does, it tells you, you know, where you are in relation to the other parts of the camp, which is quite nice. And outside of it is a rather sort of stark, very, I guess you'd call that very Eastern European style monument to the fact that men did die in the camps, not so much in the British compounds. We're talking about earlier in the war, the Soviet prisoners of war, people from other countries, and there were starvations, that they didn't treat the French terribly well there, the Germans. The British and the Commonwealth kind of got the best deal in terms of treatment by the Germans. And I forget how many prisoners died in that camp over the course of the war. Obviously, nothing like the scale of those that died in death camps, but it certainly wasn't the sort of somewhat jolly boys' vacation that some of the war movies, not just Great Escape, but movies like Danger Within and Albert RN, that kind of suggest that the camps were just sort of a gentleman's club where you could just concentrate on escaping, and people were having mental health breakdowns. They were suffering in different ways. But then we went on to back towards the town itself, and you have the little plot where there are cemeteries. There are cemeteries with graves of Soviet prisoners who died there, French prisoners who died there. And the one, of course, that particularly important in terms of, for me on this trip and for David, was to go to the memorial. These are other graves or markers of people who died in the various camps around Zagan. Is the memorial to the 50 murdered, and I think it was either 2 or 3 other British people who died at the camp. Possibly, I can't remember now. Then maybe they were shot while trying to escape in earlier escapes. There were 2 or 3 other British guys who are acknowledged there. So this is the memorial to the 50. It's kind of called. And it's really great to see that despite being it's not a remote part of Poland by any means. Zagan isn't in the middle of absolutely nowhere, but it's not on the tourist loop in broad terms. You know, people are going there to see Stalag Luft III. The hotel we stayed at, you sense that it was either just sort of business people moving through or people there. In fact, one of the couples we saw having breakfast, it was a terrible breakfast, we then saw at the museum later on. Good question, History Explorer. The 50 who were murdered. So I'm doing a kind of simplistic version. They were all picked up in various areas. Some were taken to Breslau, which was the SS and Gestapo headquarters for the area, although Breslau is about sort of 2 hours drive away. Others are picked up. And what happened, the basic procedure was, Hitler wanted all of these 76 prisoners murdered. They decided that would be too much to kind of cover up. So they decided on the round number of 50, all of whom, as the movie says, were shot while trying to escape. But in the movie, you see at the end of The Great Escape, there's Richard Attenborough talking to Gordon Jackson, he says something like, despite all this, I've never been happier than the tailgate of the Opel Blitz drops down and the MG42 kills them. They were actually killed mostly in groups of two. So they were taken off by cars, and then Gestapo agents shot them in the back of the head. And they weren't buried. They were taken back and they were cremated. What happened is, if I get the sequence of this wrong, the Great Escape and the Stalag Luft III historians will be on me like a ton of bricks. But basically, the camp senior British officer, Massey, called Ramsey in the film, played by James Donald, they heard the Germans, just as in the movie, indicated that some prisoners were brought back. They were said 50 of your men have been shot while trying to escape. And in the movie, James Donald says, how many were wounded? And the German commander says, I do not have that. I regret I do not have that information. And then later on, they found out they were murdered. But I forget which way round it happened. But pretty much what happened a few days after that is a truck of 50 urns turned up. And the urns had the names of the prisoners who were murdered. And they were, I believe, temporarily buried, these urns, or the ashes from the urns were buried where this monument is. And then after the war, when this part of Poland is going to become in the east, in the Russian zone, they removed the ashes, and they now have headstones in Poznan. And Poznan is about an hour and a half away from Zagan in Germany. So they all have their burials there, but they buried ashes, so they have their headstones there. And it's nice to see, the RAF roundel wreath there and the poppy wreaths there and their little tributes from villagers, visitors who've been there, and candles and what have you. And that is the end of my slideshow. And I can talk to you. Yeah, Commonwealth War Graves now, Rob. I can answer some more questions about this. And I say I will carry on and continue talking in future shows about my visit to Colditz and my visits to Krakow and Wrocław and what have you. But I will do that later on. The investigation into the murders was lengthy and quite complicated. There was an RAF officer tasked with it in 1945, and they did track down quite a number of the perpetrators. The Guy Walters book, The Real Great Escape, goes into some detail. Of course, one of the tragedies of the post-war era is, with the Cold War already commencing, is many senior Nazis and not so senior Nazis escaped justice because they ended up, being it was the Cold War, complicated things. So, but there were men found guilty of murders, and some of them were executed, some of them were imprisoned. There was some justice for this, and there's lots of information about that you can find there. So yeah, some justice was dealt, but Waitman Bjorn would want me to remind you that something like only about 20% of Nazis were actually brought to justice who organized the real mass killings, and beyond that, the Holocaust. It's a lot of them were never faced any punishment at all. Of course, some died during the end of the war. So people who, and the weird thing, when we went to the concentration camp just outside Krakow, the one where Amon Goth was, the guy played by Ralph Fiennes in Schindler's List, he was actually investigated by the SS during the war for being overzealous. If you can believe that, even the SS thought he was being a bit of a shithead. This is the SS. And he was put into a mental hospital at some point, and then he was captured at the end of the war when he was still a prisoner in this hospital. And then he was an a Krakow survivor recognized him, and he was brought to trial, and he was hanged back at the camp in Krakow where he had been commandant, and he was executed there. But even the SS investigated some of their own people for cruelty, which is just crazy to think about. But I've gone off on a tangent at that point. So I'm going to go on and just talk about, again, my reaction to being at this location, because they say that never meet your heroes, and when you meet someone you wanted to meet, is it sometimes disappointing? And the issue with wanting to have been to this site for 50 years is that did it reach the expectations? What was I expecting to see when I found there? What was I expecting to feel? Well, I had no expectations. What I can say is it's a complicated, nuanced feeling because, like as I've said this on the channel numerous times, when I see the Battle of Britain Memorial fight Lancaster, I have a conflict with my head. Part of me, the 10-year-old boy in me, goes, "Oh, bloody hell, that's a Lancaster." And I get really excited at seeing and hearing the roar of those Merlin engines and seeing Spitfires long inside. The 10-year-old boy in me loves the Lancaster. But the other part of my brain is reminds me that that was a weapon designed to bring death, and there's no sugarcoating it. The Bomber Command were there to bring death. I mean, you can argue that some of the classic aircraft were defensive in nature. The Spitfire is to defend Britain from attack. Okay, it was used in the offensive role as well, but the Lancaster has no defensive design at all. It is there to bring the war to an end by the use of strategic bombing. And so when I look at the Lancaster, I say the 10-year-old boy thinks, "Oh my God, there's a Lancaster." The other part of me thinks, "God," and that there's a weapon that brought death to tens of thousands. And I'm not saying it wasn't worth doing. I'm not getting into that. I'm just saying that I'm glad I have that mental conflict. And I had that similar feeling standing in the forest in Zagan, in that the little boy in me, the guy who loves The Great Escape, and I will watch it again in the next few days. That bit of excitement of being there, to think that the cooler building, the blocks of where the base of the coolers were there, and when we're there, we're thinking of Steve McQueen and his baseball glove and the baseball there, and there's kind of an element of fulfillment of that movie fan aspect of me being there. But the other part of me is thinking about, as I said earlier, the probable futility of that escape, and was it all worth it? And was Bushell too obsessed with getting one over? He had, of course, if you don't know where his hatred of the SS and the Gestapo came from, he had been part of a successful escape earlier in the war before he was taken to Stalag Luft III. And long story short, I think he was in Yugoslavia somewhere, and he was helped by local Yugoslavians. And when someone else betrayed them to the Germans, and they were picked up and they were given, I mean, Bushell was tortured by the Gestapo, but he was taken back to the prisoner of war camp. But the civilians who had helped him, if I remember correctly, were murdered by the Gestapo. And the Gestapo told, if I remember correctly, they told Bushell, we have murdered those civilians who were helping you," kind of as a deterrent, as a kind of a warning. And that idea that his escape had resulted in the death of civilians drove him to want to seek his revenge on the Nazis. And revenges are never a good thing. And so I'm there thinking about, would it have been better for those 50 men if Bushell hadn't been put to the Stalag Luft III? Would they have carried on just trying to do the blitz escapes of 2 and 3? Because what did they think was going to happen if the 200 men had got out? Of course, all the infrastructure was going to kick off. Of course, every German on every railway platform would be aware, for anybody between the age of 20 and 30 male walking around who looked a bit out of place, they'd be swept up immediately. If they had carried on with trying to get out 2 or 3 men at a time, as with the wooden horse escape 2 years earlier, where all 3 men did get back to friendly countries, they all got to Sweden. Maybe they'd have actually got more men home, fewer at a time, than trying to do this big escape that, as we said, in the end resulted in 50 men being murdered. So my brain went into all those complicated thoughts there. It also got me thinking about what it would be like to be locked up in a prisoner of war camp, and it got me thinking about mental health and how that would be something these men would carry for the rest of their lives. The other thing, and Philip Blood has kind of put it into words for me, is the Stalag Luft III and the Oflags, they were for officers. And this Stalag Luft III, there were the odd enlisted man there, but mostly aviators. There were a few army. But as I said, they had libraries, they had sports equipment they could put on planes, they got decent rations from the Red Cross. They weren't forced to work. They, as Philip has pointed out there, if you're an enlisted man, if you're a corporal captured at Dunkirk and you were taken to a camp, you may well be expected to work 8, 9, 10 hours a day. Now, again, not brutal work as what's happening in the proper concentration camps, but still work nonetheless. And maybe less in the way of facilities, not the theatres, not the recreation areas. So officers were not allowed to work under the terms of the Geneva Convention. Officers were not have. They could volunteer to oversee work. This was all covered by Alec Guinness in a bridge on the River Kwai. So the enlisted men experience in the POW system was far worse than that of the officers. And I think we all need to kind of take a step backwards and realize that era we had I watched the Colditz story about 2 weeks ago before the trip, just to show Mag something about Colditz. And because our German guide at Colditz, and I'll talk about this in the Colditz show, reminded us that it means nothing to Germans, Colditz. Colditz is very much a British and Commonwealth thing. It's us who grew up with the movie in the 50s with John Mills and Lionel Jeffries, and the TV series in the 70s with David McCallum and Edward Hardwick and Robert Wagner. And it's a British thing, The Great Escape. It's a British. I mean, Americans like the movie as well. But it was a sort of a sport. The Germans weren't in a way wrong when they said this escaping can no longer be considered a sport. I mean, they were wrong to exert the punishments they did on escapers. But there had been this kind of upper class posh thing about, like being a boarding school. And you kind of get that in the movies. The Colditz and the guards are kind of almost portrayed in the kind of the bumbling Hogan's Heroes. Not for you this time, Tommy, ticking off. And, you get no midnight snacks from the tuck shop if you get caught escaping. And that, yeah, there were senior NCOs at the camp as well, air crews as well. So, yeah, I'm going off on a tangent, but when you travel, it should get you to think. That's why we travel. And we were going for, as I said at the beginning of this show, we were going from really nice food, and the food was, apart from one meal at the place we stayed in Zagan, which was pretty awful. The food was outstanding. Krakow, the food was fantastic, and Berlin, the food was incredible, and great Italian restaurant, which is the only place open in Rochlitz, and that was a great best Italian I've had in years. So you're having great food, great company. We're having lots of giggles and laughs as a group of friends there, and then you're going into places of real sobriety, real horror. I mean, Auschwitz, and I'll talk about that, and Krakow, and the square in Krakow where they were in, the roundups were taken, the deportations, and my friend David bought me a box set of books from Auschwitz. I started reading one of them on the flight back from Berlin to Paris, and we don't need to be reminded how horrible the Holocaust was, and yet we do need to be reminded how horrible the Holocaust was, because your brain tries to smooth it over. Your brain doesn't want to admit human beings can be as shit as they can to each other, and then when you're at these sites, it was a brilliant week, but it would be fair to say it had some highs and lows. I'll talk about that later on. But Stalag Luft III is, it was an important trip for me. It was an important pilgrimage, and it did some good things in that I was able to stand in places I've been thinking about 50 years, but it also got me to think about the reasons behind the escape and the motivations and how everything affects everything else. As we've talked about on the channel before, the commando raids in the Channel Islands are the things that set about the commando order that turns the German policy against captured men behind the lines different, and that affects what happened with the SAS and the SOE, and this undoubtedly had a negative effect around the rest of the POW camp system. Not only beyond the 50 who were murdered, it had a negative effect elsewhere. And anyway, I might go on another trip to where Germans held. There's other things I want to do. We'll see. I'm thinking of maybe Crete next year. So there we are. I will end it at that, because I didn't really expect to be doing this, and I hope you have appreciated it. I'll do a Colditz one at some point. I don't know when. Tomorrow night, I know tomorrow's night's guest, Damien, is going to be ready. I don't know what happened today. Maybe in the snow with Frank. I'll find out, hopefully. But in the meantime, welcome back to the channel. And while I've been away, I'm glad a lot of you have been carrying on watching the older content and going back and catching up on the shows you'd not seen before. A few new patrons have signed up, which is fantastic. Don't forget, you can help me create more content by becoming a patron, by buying the books of my guests, and doing all that work to support it. I've pretty much stopped posting on Twitter, or X as it's called. Blue Sky has gone from strength to strength. I left for the trip with 800 followers on Blue Sky. I'm up to 2.7 thousand now, so 8 days to get another 1,900 subscribers. The historians are joining it in droves. Colin, you're not there yet on Blue Sky yet, or if you're not, you should be there. I'm going to be stopping Wind on Twitter, and for the people saying it's a political move, it's not a political move at all. It's a mental health move in many ways. Twitter has become an absolute cesspit. It has been such a brilliant tool, and the last 6 months, year or so, it's just gone downhill. You can't block people like you used to. There's nothing done about the people spewing anti-Semitism, spewing Holocaust denial, spewing bullshit, and it's just become a toxic place that is no longer enjoyable to spend time on. Facebook is going a similar way in many ways, and yet they're run by people with different ends of the political spectrum. I just want an environment where it's open dialogue. We all want free speech, but we also want the ability to block out hate. And Blue Sky is currently where it's happening. Blue Sky is a nice, seemingly safe platform. There's lots of stuff, lots of going in there. So I urge you all to sign up on Blue Sky. But as for now, I'm going to say good evening. Enjoy the rest of your Wednesday. I will see you all again tomorrow for the show about the Spanish part of the French Second Army Division liberating Paris back in August. And I'll find out when I can get today's show about Monte Cassino rescheduled for a third time. I'm sure it was a good reason why it didn't happen. But in the meantime, thanks everybody for watching. I hope you enjoyed my hastily put together photo album. I will see you all again. Cheers, everybody. Bye.